also said that during the buildup to World War II, the railroad system transported 90% of military supplies and 95% of military personnel. In fact, just east of Chillicothe, the National Fireworks Company manufactured thousands of shells for the Navy that helped win the war in the Pacific.
During the 40s, when, like I said, when the war was going on, you'd see, I remember seeing a troop train of prisoners go through. And every day, every train that came in, of course back then you run a lot of passenger trains, they run 6 or 8 a day, you know. And all the service guys coming in and also getting on to report back to their base wherever they was going, you know. Because a lot of times they didn't fly like they do now, you know.
The inception of the B&O over on the East End around Baltimore even had some doings with the Civil War. And then it come west, and during World War II, they run troop trains through here just left and right, going to Baltimore, over to Washington, of course, and they would run troop trains through there. My dad used to tell me about they'd be on there, they couldn't get off the train, and he was working at the time as a baggage clerk, and they would send him over to Taylor's Stag Bar right there on the corner to get sandwiches or candy or whatever and bring it back to him.
Working for the railroad offered a rewarding livelihood, yet it was accompanied by numerous challenges. At its peak, the Chillicothe Railroad system employed over 1,500 workers. Metal workers, rail installers, and other personnel ensured that the tracks were correctly installed and in proper working order to facilitate the movement of trains. Boilermakers, steam engine mechanics, and others made sure trains were ready for service. Conductors, engineers, and brakemen were responsible for adhering to strict schedules. In order to meet the ever more demanding schedules, train crews stayed by their home phone and waited for the call to come to work.
I know one year I took my wife to Columbus for her birthday, take her out to dinner, and I called him beforehand. I said, "Am I going to have to work tonight?" "No, Tony, you're not going to have to work." So at that time, we just got the little beeper things. You know, they can beep you. Got up there and sat down, ordered coffee, and my beeper went off. So there we had to head back home, get my stuff, and then drive back to Columbus and go to work.
Never knowing when or where the next assignment would take them, crews found that family time wasn't always easy to plan for.
It's something you got used to and your family got used to. That was the biggest thing. It was a different type of work. You work 24 hours a day, you might as well say, but you got time off when you come home and you work towards your vacation, and but you were still on duty a lot. And it seemed like the railroad and families that worked on the railroad, a lot of nepotism come into it. You know, my dad worked, his dad worked. You know, you had a lot of generations that worked on the railroad, and they knew that's what it was.
The occupation was strenuous, physically demanding, and inherently dangerous. A significant number of workers sustained fatal or severe injuries during the construction and operation of the railroad.
Well, I could tell you this one story, but there was a fellow I was working with at the Austin powder plant, conductor, and kind of a gruesome story to tell you the truth, but he had fell off a tank car and it cut off his arm right at the shoulder. He lived, but like the lady said to come, as far as EMS, there wasn't much you could do about it except put pressure. That's all they did, was wrap him with tape as tight as they could. And he lived. He lived quite a few years after that and learned how to get around with just one arm.
There's one article that I read where you have a stove like this in the Caboose, and this one is a coal stove. Some had a coal, some had wood, and you had a bunker for the fuel. And this particular accident that I was reading about was a wood stove. And what one of the firemen, or not the fireman, but the brakeman was doing to make kindling, to have wood to take on a trip, is as the train was sitting in the yard and rolling very slowly through the train yard, he was standing out here on the back of the platform, and he was feeding lumber down onto the track between the wheel and the track, and as the train rolled over it, it would splinter it and then they would go back and pick it up, and they would use that. That was the fuel that they were going to burn in the stove. And as he was doing that, the engineer must have accelerated a little bit too much and kind of jerked the caboose a little bit, and he fell off, and that caboose ran over him and took his leg off. It's just, I mean, it was a different breed of people back then to do this kind of job.
The older guys, I mean, they had to have a tough back because, I mean, when you're piling in spikes in a tie plate and you got X amount that you put in that tie plate and you're up there pounding them down, guy next door to you right straight across, you guys work together, bang, bang, bang down the track.
Numerous train derailments and collisions occurred in the initial years of operation. Safety rapidly became a principal concern, leading to the gradual implementation of new technologies and protocols that significantly mitigated the system's susceptibility to accidents.
Working with crossing protection, I had crossing protection to work on. Same thing, safety's the name of the game there. And make sure that the crossing is safe for the public and that everything works all right. You maintain those. Every 30 days you had to inspect them, make sure everything's working all right to keep them running good, and then that helps keep the injuries down from crossings and the employees that worked on the railroad.
Here's one kind of thing a little bit different than what people maybe, I don't know whether they still realize or they don't, but back when I retired, see, we still had hobos. One time I was over at Parkersburg, flagging on the caboose, and you had to walk the train and set all the brakes off out of the yards. So I got all the train walked and started to get on the caboose. And the car inspector said, "Buddy," he said, "do you care about this guy riding in the caboose with you?" I said, "I certainly do." He said, "I'm going to tell him to get off there because you don't want him on there." And a lot of times I would lie to him, a lot of times in the yards, because a guy will come in and he'll say, which way is this train going?" I said, "It's going right straight east." And I always hoped I'd never see him again.
As we have seen from the early 1830s, the country began to grow faster and in more directions than ever before. The canal system, once used to move people and goods, was being overtaken by the faster, more accessible railroad systems. Moving people and freight was now done in hours, which would have normally taken several days.
Much as the railroad took the place of the Ohio Erie Canal, it was a faster, safer, more economical way of transporting goods. Railroads, which are still around, a lot of people think the railroads are dead, and they're not. There's still a lot of freight trains run through this town all the time, and all over the country, including passenger trains like Amtrak and things like that. But in general, railroads aren't the main carrier like they used to be. And what happened was you had the age of automobiles come in, semi-trucks, planes. Nobody's going to build anything that's going to take your goods faster across the country or overseas than an airplane. So the railroads kind of fell out. They weren't as important, as big. Couldn't do some of the things that you could do with some of the